She was locked away like property, but she never stopped being a person, in a crumbling warehouse on the edge of a dying town. A young Apache woman faced a fate no one should strip of her freedom, her name, and her voice, yet still holding on to the fire inside. Then one night, a stranger opened the wrong door and saw her, not just her body, but her defiance. And that's when she spoke, trembling. "You saw me naked. Now you must marry me, or they'll kill us both." What would you do if a moment of chance tied your fate to a woman you just met, one who'd survived things no one should? Would you walk away or stay and fight for something neither of you thought you still deserved? Dignity, trust, maybe even love. This is the story of Jonas and Noya, of two souls shaped by loss, drawn together not by rescue, but by choice. A story of survival, silence, and the quiet rebuilding of a life worth living. If this touched something in you, like and subscribe to Wild West Echoes. Leave a comment. Would you have stayed now? Let's go back to where it all began, in Silver Flats. In the silence of a crumbling warehouse, a locked door hid more than just shadows. It hid a girl, stripped of everything but defiance. Jonas Fletcher hadn't planned to stay in Silver Flats. It was the kind of town you passed through with your coat collar high and your name kept to yourself. Once a promising silver boomtown, it had since dulled to dust and regrets. The saloon leaned to one side like it had given up on standing straight, and the sheriff's office had a door that no longer shut all the way. Even the wind seemed tired here. Still, the storm clouds pressing low over the distant hills meant he'd be riding into trouble if he pushed on. So he unhitched his mule at the edge of town and led it behind a boarded-up smithy, scanning the street like he always did, half from habit, half from the kind of memory that never quite quiets. The warehouse was the last structure before the road disappeared into red dirt. Its roof sagged in the middle, and one of the shutters hung by a single nail. But it looked dry, and Jonas had spent more than a few nights in worse. He pushed the door open slow, careful not to make noise, and stepped into air thick with mildew, dust, and the faint scent of coal oil. He laid his bedroll near a stack of crack crates and took off his hat, letting the quiet settle. It was the kind of silence that didn't quite feel alone. Then came the sound, not loud, not obvious, but enough. It wasn't the skitter of rats or the groan of old wood. This was different, human. A sharp breath, a muffled shuffling, a pause that held something more than fear, held awareness. Jonas went still, hand brushing the butt of his revolver. Another sound, faint, like someone stifling a sob or trying not to be found. He moved toward the back of the warehouse, slow and quiet. The far wall had once been partitioned into storage stalls. One door, half-hinged, was secured with a length of rusted chain looped through an iron latch. The chain didn't look new, but the footprints in the dust near it were. He crouched, pressing his ear close, breath ragged, close. With one steady motion, he loosened the chain. The latch gave a screech of protest, but the door cracked open. Inside, light barely touched the space. A broken sliver of moon through the wallboards caught on bare skin, shoulder, knee, and the flash of long dark hair. The girl sat crouched in the far corner, back pressed against the wall, her arms tight around her chest. Young, Apache, no more than 20. Dirt smeared her arms and legs, but her eyes, they weren't dulled by fear. They burned. Jonas didn't move. She looked right at him, her voice low and raw. "You saw me naked. Now you must marry me, or they will kill us both." He blinked, not from the words, but from how she said them. Not pleading, not panicked, just certain. He glanced around the stall. No clothes, No blanket, just a cracked water bowl and a worn piece of cloth that might have once been a dress. The walls were nailed shut. She hadn't been hiding. She'd been caged. Jonas took a slow breath. "You must marry me," she said again, firmer now, "or they will say I have no worth. And you will die for seeing what they said belonged to them." She wasn't wrong. He'd seen that kind of thinking before in camps, in brothels, in back rooms where no one with a badge dared step. In towns like this, a woman like her was property, and a man like him could become a problem real quick just by noticing. And yet, he hadn't come in looking for this, but he was here, and she was waiting. Outside the thin walls, footsteps scuffed against the gravel, low voices, laughter. Then closer, the unmistakable scrape of a boot along the wooden ramp outside the warehouse door. Jonas's hand moved back to the revolver. One choice. One moment. He turned to her. "Can you stand?" She nodded, just once. Then came the knock. A slow, deliberate thud that echoed down the hallway like the end of something just beginning. Some pacts are spoken loud. Others, like this one, are forged in silence between strangers and the sound of approaching boots. Jonas didn't need more than a second. As the knock echoed through the warehouse, he reached for the coat draped over his bedroll and turned to the girl Noya. He would learn later without a word. The coat swallowed her small frame, but it gave her back a sliver of dignity, which she accepted without hesitation. Her bare feet were silent on the wood as she followed him through the narrow passage toward the rear of the building. The back window had been boarded, but the bottom slats were loose. Jonas pried one free with the butt of his revolver, motioned her through first. She moved quickly, gracefully, despite the chill in the air and the weight of exhaustion on her body. He followed, dropping into the dust behind her just as a voice bellowed from the front. "Hey, you in there!" Jonas didn't stop to answer. The moon was bright enough to paint the landscape in cold, gray tones. He led her down an embankment behind the building, cutting across scrubland toward the edge of town where his wagon waited. Each step was careful, calculated, not running, but not lingering. The soft crunch of their feet on dry earth was the only sound between them. They reached the wagon just as the voices grew louder behind. Jonas tossed his rifle onto the bench, unhitched the brake, and climbed up. He reached down to help her up, steady but firm. No time for questions, no time for introductions. Once inside, Noya pulled the coat tighter, nestling into the hay and canvas beneath the wagon's tarp. Jonas snapped the reins. The mule started forward with a groan, wheels creaking into motion. They didn't speak. He guided the wagon down a narrow trail that split from the main road, curving behind a ridge of black rock. Sagebrush clawed at the wheels as they passed, and the wind stirred the dry branches like whispers just beyond reach. Behind them, the warehouse shrank into the dark. The road ahead was rough, scattered with stones, but Jonas didn't slow. His jaw set hard, eyes scanning the trail with the practiced calm of someone used to night roads and long silences. Inside the wagon bed, Noya didn't cry. She didn't ask where they were going, or who he was, or what he wanted. She simply watched the shadows move, eyes sharp beneath the hood of the coat. Jonas reached into the supply box at his side and pulled out a piece of dried bread, a canteen, and a folded blanket. He passed them through the canvas flap without a word. She took them without thanks. They ate separately. But something settled between them that wasn't just caution. It was an understanding, formed not in conversation, but in the weight of shared danger. Neither owed the other an explanation. Not yet. But both knew the road they'd just left behind could not be retraced. A flash split the sky behind them. Not lightning, Not this time. A gunshot. It cracked through the hills like a stone dropped into a still pond. Jonas tensed, reined in the mule to listen. One shot. Then silence. But it was enough to tell him someone had seen, and someone cared. Noya's hand gripped the edge of the canvas. Their cover was already wearing thin. The trail turned rocky again, winding through a narrow pass flanked by boulders shaped by centuries of wind. The wagon bumped hard over the uneven ground, and Jonas glanced back once. Just a flicker. She met his eyes. There was no fear in her look, not anymore. There was a warning. If I'm caught, I won't forgive silence. It didn't need to be said aloud. Jonas understood. He'd known men who'd claimed to help, only to vanish when the cost got too high. He'd been one of those who stayed once. And he'd buried more than one friend who did the same. He flicked the reins again, urging the mule onward. By the time the moon dropped behind the hills, the town was far behind. The scrub gave way to open earth, flat and cracked. No water, no light, just land, hard and quiet. Jonas spotted the outline of an old structure tucked against a rise in the terrain. A weather-beaten cabin with one wall slumped inward and smoke stains still clinging to its chimney. Likely abandoned since the last miners left the region years ago. It wasn't much, but it had 4 walls and a roof. He turned the wagon toward it, inside the canvas. Noya shifted. She hadn't asked where they were going, but now she peeked out just slightly, her face unreadable. Jonas pulled the wagon to a stop near the door and set the brake. The mule dropped its head, grateful for the pause. He climbed down, checked the hinges of the door. It held. Then he stepped back to the wagon and looked at her fully for the first time. You'll be safe here. For the night. Still no reply. Just a slow nod. She climbed out, silent but steady, clutching the coat around her. The wind tugged at her hair. Dust blew across the plains behind them, soft but constant. Jonas opened the cabin door, the hinges groaning like an old man's knees. He stepped inside first, then lit a match. The glow flickered against broken floorboards and a stone hearth still black from its last fire. Behind him, Noya stood at the threshold, framed by starlight. The desert didn't sleep. But for tonight, they might. She wasn't shaking anymore. Not from cold. Not from fear. She just stared straight ahead, daring the night to test her again. The inside of the cabin smelled like ash and dry rot, the air heavy with memories too old to name. Jonas dropped his gear by the doorway, checked the windows cracks in 2 corners, but no real gaps, and nudged a pile of old wood beside the hearth. With slow hands, he built a fire. Nothing loud, just enough to chase the chill and give the space a kind of hush that didn't feel entirely broken. When the flames took, their light danced across the split walls and rose-beam ceiling, flickering against the bones of a place once meant for permanence. Noya sat near the hearth, legs folded beneath her, wrapped in his coat. Her skin still carried the pale gray of moonlight and travel dust. Her hair, long and unbrushed, hung over her shoulders in thick waves. But she didn't shrink, didn't fold in on herself like someone trying to vanish. She sat straight, gaze forward, shoulders squared like someone waiting to be tested. Jonas didn't offer words. He moved to the small crate where he kept his supplies, broke off a piece of hard bread, and held it out. No ceremony, no explanation. She took it, nodding once. Still no thank you. They ate in silence, just the pop of the fire and the low moan of wind nudging the corners of the cabin. Jonas settled near the doorway, legs outstretched, rifle across his lap. His eyes stayed on the window, not because he expected someone tonight, but because that's what men like him did when they didn't know how to fill the space between people. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then, quietly, she spoke. "I was taken when I was 7. He didn't look at her, not right away. They came into our camp at dusk. Not soldiers, just men with horses and whiskey and too much time. My mother died before dawn. My brother tried to run. I don't know if he made it." Her voice didn't crack. It didn't even rise. She spoke like someone reciting something long memorized in inventory of losses. "They traded me, camp to camp. Some said they'd keep me. Some said I'd fetch more if I stayed clean. Others just passed me off. Said I was trouble." Jonas said nothing. He didn't ask why she was locked in that warehouse or what they planned next. Some answers come without asking. "I don't cry," she said. "Not anymore." That was the first time she looked at him directly since the fire lit. Not in fear, not with expectation, but with a challenge, like she was daring him to pity her. He didn't. Instead, he shifted the rifle across his knees, checking the latch, then glanced back to the window. "I've seen worse," she added after a moment. "But that don't make this any easier." Jonas didn't respond, not because he didn't have words, but because none felt honest enough. Silence settled again. Then softly, but clear, her voice cut through it. "Why didn't you look at me like they did?" It wasn't said with shame or curiosity. It was something sharper, something weary. He turned his head, just enough to meet her eyes. The fire cracked between them. He could have said a dozen things about decency, about having a mother who raised him better, about the line between being a man and being something else entirely. But he didn't. He just held her gaze and let the moment pass through them. Sometimes the absence of a look is the deepest answer. Noya didn't press. She pulled the coat tighter, the bread still in her hand, untouched now. The shadows from the fire danced across her cheek, softening the lines the years had carved too early. She lay down near the hearth, not curled, but stretched like someone who'd forgotten how to sleep small. Her back stayed to the wall, her face to the door. Jonas waited until her breath slowed, then pulled his bedroll closer to the entryway. He didn't need sleep. Not yet. His eyes stayed on the crack in the window, scanning the ridgeline beyond. But inside, he wasn't watching for riders. He was thinking of a girl who didn't cry, and a question he didn't expect to carry with him into the next morning. When a woman wears a man's shirt, it's often the end of a story. But for her, it was the first time she could breathe. The morning air was cool and clean, the kind that carried the scent of old rain and pine bark. Outside the cabin, the sky was pale blue, stretched thin over the dry ridges. The fire from the night before had burned down to a soft nest of embers. Jonas stirred it back to life with a stick, coaxing it into a low flame. From the edge of the doorway, he saw her barefoot, hair unbraided, walking down the short path to the narrow stream behind the cabin. She was wearing his shirt. It hung loose on her, sleeves rolled up past her elbows, hem brushing her knees. She moved with quiet precision, dipping her hands into the cold water, cupping it to splash over her face, wiping gently at the grime of the days behind them. He didn't look away, but he didn't look through her either. There was no hunger in his gaze, only something like memory. The kind that sits heavy in the chest, but doesn't ache quite as sharp with time. Jonas had watched his wife wash her face the same way, years ago, behind a sod house in South Dakota. Her hands were smaller than Noya's, her hair a softer brown. She used to hum while she did it some old song she never named, and just like that ghost was gone again, drifting back where it came from. When Noya turned, she caught him watching. She didn't flinch, didn't cover herself. She simply lifted her chin, the morning sun hitting her face square on. "I borrowed this," she said, voice flat, neutral. "You needed something clean," he replied. She gave a short nod, then walked back toward the cabin. They ate on the stoop half a loaf of bread Jonas had baked 2 nights prior, a tin of beans, and water from the creek, warmed slightly in a dented pot. No one had to say it wasn't much, but it was hot, and shared, and not stolen. Noya tore the bread with careful fingers, not delicate, just deliberate. Every movement she made seemed like it had purpose, as if even sitting still was something earned. Jonas chewed in silence, watching the way she squinted into the morning sun. Her eyes never stayed still. They moved from the trees, to the ridge, to the sky. Not nervous, just practiced. She spoke first. "You always keep this quiet." He glanced sideways. "The land does most of it. No talk, no questions, not unless they matter." She nodded again. Then, after a beat, added, "That's good." It might have been the closest thing to approval he'd heard in a long time. He leaned back on one elbow, tapping his boot heel against the edge of the porch. "First horse I ever bought kicked me so hard I flew backward into a rain barrel." Whole town laughed. I was 22. Thought I knew everything. A pause, then soft, like a sound she hadn't meant to let slip. Noya laughed, just once, not a giggle. Not a loud bark, just a breath of air that carried something lighter than anything she'd held since he'd met her. Jonas smiled without showing teeth. He didn't press for more, didn't say glad to hear it or you should laugh more. He just let it be. They ate in quiet again, but it wasn't the kind that bruised. It rested around them like shade on a hot day. Noya leaned her back against the wall, pulling her knees up, fingers laced in front of her. "You think that mule of yours would kick you now?" Jonas shook his head. "We've come to terms." Another breath of almost laughter. Almost. But it stayed. For a little while. The sun climbed higher, and Jonas stood, brushing crumbs off his lap. He stretched once, then walked toward the tree line to check the mule's reins. That's when he saw it, pressed faintly into the dirt near the edge of the pine's hoofprints. Fresh, less than half a day old, headed south to north, parallel to their trail, not local. He crouched beside them, one hand brushing the dry earth, feeling the loose give beneath the print. Light rider, moving fast, not casual, not good. He stood, looking out across the tree line. Nothing moved, but the air had shifted. Behind him, Noya was watching, her face turned toward him like she already knew what he'd found. Jonas didn't say it. He didn't have to. Their space, for all its quiet and warmth, would not be theirs for long. The river doesn't ask who you are, where you've been, or what shame you carry. It just moves forward. So did they. The sun hadn't yet cleared the edge of the horizon when Jonas hitched the mule and rolled the wagon down the slope behind the cabin. The sky stretched wide and soft above them, brushed with the last mist of morning. A narrow stream shimmered nearby, barely knee-deep in places, but steady. It coiled like a silver thread through the low hills, carving a quiet path that promised at least a few miles of cover. They followed it in silence, the wagon wheels groaning low against the earth, the mule steady as ever. Noya sat on the wagon bench beside Jonas, the shirt still too big on her frame, her eyes scanning the ridgeline. She hadn't spoken since he told her about the tracks. She didn't need to. She already understood what they meant. Time was short. Again. The trail along the river wasn't marked, but Jonas knew the shape of land like he knew the shape of loss. He could read which trees meant higher ground, which bends meant shelter, which breaks in the stone might offer places to hide. About an hour in, he broke the quiet. My wife's name was Ellen. He didn't look at her when he said it. His voice didn't crack or falter, just a flat truth, laid down like a worn coin. She died 8 years ago. Fever took her before the doc could even get to the farm. There was a child, too. Didn't make it. The wheels kept turning. The river whispered nearby. She was kind. Stronger than me, if I'm being honest. Grew up baking in winters so cold her fingers cracked. Still found ways to smile. He paused, watching the mule's ears flick forward. After she passed, I went south, worked ranch jobs, freight, took to the road. Never figured I'd stay long in one place again. Still no reply from Noya, but he felt her shift slightly beside him, not toward, not away, just a quiet acknowledgement that his words had been heard. A few more turns along the river. Then she spoke. The woman who raised me didn't speak my language, not even once. Her voice was soft, not bitter, just worn. She was white, bought me from a trader after the war, called me Little Bird, said I was lucky to have a roof. Jonas didn't interrupt. She never hit me, fed me regular, but every time I asked her what my name meant, she said it didn't matter anymore, that I was hers now, not Apache, not anything. A long silence fell between them, heavier than before. The river murmured, brushing against smooth stones, indifferent to what passed beside it. "Is Noya your given name?" Jonas asked. Quiet. She nodded once. "My father whispered it to me. I remember that much." He didn't ask more. Instead, he reached into the satchel tucked behind his seat and pulled out a small bundle of leather. He opened it slowly and took out an old knife, its wooden handle smooth from use. The blade sharpened to a narrow crescent. The steel wasn't pretty, but it was honest. Without ceremony, he handed it to her. She looked at it for a long moment before accepting. "For me, for you," he said. "Not because you need to fight, but because you have the right to." She turned the knife in her hand, testing the grip. Her fingers fit naturally around the hilt. "You keep it close," he added, "not just for danger. Sometimes it's good just to know you're not empty-handed." She nodded again, this time, slower. The kind of nod that meant more than agreement. It meant understanding. They rode another hour without speaking. The sun climbed higher, drying the dew from the grass. Birds called from the trees above the riverbank, and the wind carried the scent of sage and distant mesquite. Then, as they reached a bend in the land where the trail dipped low near a red rock bluff, Jonas felt it, that tightness in the chest, the one that came from years of being hunted or haunted. It was hard to tell which. Sometimes. He stood on the brake, slowed the mule, and turned slightly in the saddle. There it was, at the far end of the valley, where the ridge rolled down into scrubland. A faint haze of dust rose from the earth. Almost nothing. Easy to miss, unless you knew what to look for. Riders, not close, not yet. But they were coming. Jonas didn't speak, but Noya had already seen it. Her grip tightened on the knife, not from fear, but readiness. They didn't panic, but the river, like the past, didn't pause for them either. And now it was a race. Some places feel like they could be yours, if only you dared believe you deserved peace. By late afternoon, the trail led them into a wide clearing, tucked low between two ridgelines. A narrow stream ran along the edge, clear, cold, and steady. The trees here stood taller, older, their trunks twisted by wind and time. And near the far end of the clearing, where the earth rose slightly before dipping again, sat an old cabin. It leaned gently to one side, as if time had tried to take it, but hadn't quite succeeded. The front step was cracked, the roof sagged on one end, but the door still hung, and smoke stains curled up the chimney stone like ghosts of fire long since gone. Jonas pulled the wagon to a stop and stared for a long moment. It wasn't much, but maybe it could be enough. Noya didn't speak. She stepped down from the wagon and moved toward the stream first, dipping her fingers in the cold water. Then she looked back at the cabin, not with hope. Not yet, but without resistance. That was something. They spent the next hour in quiet labor. Jonas cleared the brush from the front and propped the porch beam with a sturdy log from the supply stack. Inside, the air was dry, dust heavy in the corners. Noya opened the windows to let the light in. She swept the floor with a branch broom. Jonas rebuilt the hearth with stones he pulled from the stream bank. By dusk, a fire burned low and clean, and for the first time in what felt like days, the scent of something warm filled the air beans and corn mash, simmering in an old tin pot. Noya sat cross-legged near the fire, her back straight, a strip of worn fabric in her lap. The torn remains of her dress. She held a needle carved from bone, threading it with hand-twisted cord from a pouch she'd kept in her bundle. Her fingers worked quick, sure not careful like someone preserving beauty, but efficient like someone reclaiming what was hers. Jonas watched without speaking, his hands wrapped around a cup of warm water. He'd seen soldiers stitch wounds slower than she stitched seams. After a while, he rose and stepped outside. The front door had come off one hinge entirely. He pulled it flat, measured the lean, then worked it back into place with a hammerstone and a pair of rusted nails salvaged from the shed. It wasn't perfect, but it would close, and that meant something. When he came back inside, Noya looked up once, then down again, silent approval. They ate sitting on opposite sides of the small table. The food was simple, but it was hot, and that alone made it taste like a feast. For a long time, the only sounds were the fire and the quiet scrape of spoons on tin. Then Noya rose to tuck the mended dress into her bundle near the wagon door. As she did, her hand brushed against something in the darkened corner. A folded scarf, faded red, edged in blue stitching. She held it up, studying the fabric, the loose threads, the faint scent of lavender that hadn't fully faded despite the dust. Jonas looked over and saw it too. "I didn't know it was there," he said softly. Noya didn't answer. She held the scarf between her fingers like something fragile, then folded it carefully and placed it on the mantel above the hearth. Not discarded, not kept, just set aside. That said more than any words could have. Outside. The wind softened. The trees rustled gently, and the last light of day bled through the window in golden streaks. When it came time to sleep, they didn't speak about where. Jonas laid one bedroll near the wall, close to the fire. Noya unrolled hers beside it, not touching, but not apart, no pretense, no excuse. It wasn't the cold this time. It was the space between them, no longer empty. When he raised the rifle, his heart didn't race. But the man on the other side did not expect mercy. He expected blood. The morning broke slow and heavy. Mist still curled low along the stream bed, and dew clung to the cabin's wood like cold sweat. Jonas had just stepped out to gather kindling when he felt it, that stillness, the kind that came before a storm, before a fight, before something broke that couldn't be fixed. Hoofbeats, faint but unmistakable, coming from the ridge, growing louder. He dropped the bundle of sticks and turned toward the trail. 3 riders, all men, all armed. They didn't gallop in like outlaws. No, they approached with purpose, like men who believed the law was already on their side, or worse, that it didn't matter. Jonas didn't wait. He stepped back inside the cabin, closing the door behind him. Noya was standing near the hearth, as if she'd already known. "They found us," he said simply. She didn't ask how many. She just reached for the small rifle resting near the firewood pile. She checked the chamber's steady hands. No hesitation, then moved behind a wooden board, leaned against the rear wall, her shadow melting into the corner. Jonas took up position near the front window, rifle raised, but not aimed. He pulled the curtain aside just enough to see their faces. He knew the look they wore, entitlement wrapped in cruelty. The leader broad-shouldered, mustached, with a red neckerchief called out without dismounting. "We ain't here to cause trouble," the man said, voice loud and smooth. "Just here for what's ours." Jonas didn't answer. "You got something don't belong to you." Still. Silence. The man shifted in his saddle. "Apache girl. We were holding her proper. She ran off with a thief. That make you the thief." Mr. Jonas opened the door slowly, stepped out just enough to be seen, rifle still resting against his forearm. Calm, measured. "She's not yours," he said. "She's my wife." The words landed like rocks dropped into still water. The men glanced at each other. The second rider spat into the dirt. The third adjusted the rifle across his lap. The leader chuckled. "That's so, that's so." The leader's smile thinned. "Well, married or not, that's tribal property you're harboring. You know how the towns around here feel about that." Jonas didn't blink. "Then you can tell the towns they're welcome to speak to me directly." A beat of silence passed. Then bang! One shot cracked into the dirt a few feet from the porch. Deliberate. Warning. Jonas didn't flinch. Behind him, Noya had her rifle up, sight fixed through the knothole in the wall. She didn't fire, but her finger was on the trigger. The leader looked down at the mark in the dirt, then back at Jonas. "We can come back," he said. "We can bring more." Jonas nodded once. "And I'll still be here." The man studied him for a moment longer, then jerked his reins. "Suit yourself." They turned, not fast, but not slow either, the way men rode when they weren't sure they liked the ending they'd just been handed. Jonas watched until they disappeared behind the trees. Then he lowered the rifle and stepped back inside. Noya emerged from her cover slowly, shoulders taut, eyes unreadable. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "Yes," Jonas replied, "and not alone." She nodded, not in fear, but in resolve. He glanced at her, then at the fire still smoldering in the hearth. It had warmed the cabin once. Now it felt like it might betray them with the smallest wisp of smoke. "We leave at dawn," he said. "For good." Noya didn't answer. She didn't have to. They both knew what tomorrow meant, and they both knew the gun had hesitated today, but next time it wouldn't. The trail ahead was dry, cracked, and uncertain, much like the road between two people learning to trust. They left before dawn, their breath visible in the cold morning air, packs tied tighter than usual, silence heavier than the night before. The cabin that had offered warmth for a heartbeat was behind them now, and the dust ahead stretched out like a question neither of them could yet answer. The wagon creaked as it rolled, the mule steady and quiet, as if even the animal knew to tread softly in moments like this. Jonas led them east, following no map, just the tilt of the land and the hush of instinct. His boots left shallow impressions in the reddish soil, soon joined by Noya's lighter steps behind him. By midday, the landscape had shifted again. Gone were the trees and creek beds. In their place, low hills, broken shale, the soft, steady crunch of gravel beneath their soles. A forgotten pioneer road, long swallowed by time, offered a barely there path rutted and brittle, shaded only by clouds and the long reach of memory. They stopped beside a rise where a few stubborn bushes clung to the slope. Jonas crouched and began stacking stones. One flat, another smaller, and a third angled slightly to the east. Noya watched. "What's it for markers?" he said, adjusting the top stone. "If something happens, if we get turned around, these tell you where you've been." She crouched next to him, picked up a narrow rock, and added it beside his. "My people stacked stones too," she said softly, "but we did it to remember the dead." Jonas didn't reply right away. "Sometimes," he said, "they're the same thing." They stood again, their shadows falling long across the dry earth. Farther on, the sun hung low behind a smear of thin clouds. The wind had picked up dry and hot now, sweeping across the open plain with no mercy. Their canteen was light, the mule even quieter than before. By late afternoon, they reached a shallow stream, half hidden by brush and framed with cracked mud. It wasn't much, just a thin trickle, but it shimmered faintly in the light, and it moved. That was enough. Jonas let the mule drink while Noya filled the canteen. They sat by the water's edge on a wide, flat stone, letting the moment slow them down. There was no talk of distance, or danger, or direction, only breath, only the now. Jonas handed her the canteen, and she drank deeply before offering it back. He took a smaller sip, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, eyes scanning the horizon, not searching, just watching. Then, quietly, "If we found somewhere off the trail, safe, would you stay?" She didn't look at him, just stared into the ripples on the water, the wind tugging at her loose hair. He waited. "I mean it," he said, setting the canteen down beside him. "I wouldn't ask if I wasn't sure." Still, she didn't speak, but her fingers, resting in her lap, moved slowly, deliberately, until they touched the back of his hand. Not gripping, not reaching, just touching. And somehow, that was more than a yes. Jonas didn't speak either. He just turned his palm upward, letting her hand settle into his. The sky dimmed slightly. A hawk circled overhead. The mule stirred, its ears twitching. Then Jonas froze. His body leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowed, jaw tightening. There, just beyond the ridge dust, a familiar shape, low and curling, rising unnaturally in the still afternoon air. Noya saw it too. This time, it wasn't distant. This time, it wasn't vague. It was closer. Jonas stood slowly, hand instinctively resting on the rifle at his side. "They're not letting go." Noya rose beside him. "Neither am I." He looked at her fully, clearly, and saw not the girl he'd found locked behind a rusted door, but the woman who had walked with him into something unknown and unspoken. He nodded once, then turned to the wagon. "We move at dusk," he said, "off trail. No fire tonight." Noya picked up the canteen. Together, they left the stone where they'd sat, no markers this time. The land ahead was harsher now, but so were they. Some fights aren't about winning. They're about saying you don't get to take what isn't yours again. By nightfall, they had reached it. The canyon wasn't wide, barely the length of a barn door at its mouth, but its walls rose steep and unforgiving on either side. Carved by ancient floods and long abandoned by anyone with sense, it was now nothing more than a scar across the earth. But Jonas remembered it. He'd camped here once, years ago, during a bitter winter when bounty work had taken him too far from the towns and too deep into the kind of silence that leaves a man staring at the shape of his soul. He knew its corners, knew the blind spots, knew the ledge 20 feet up where sound traveled down but never up. If they were going to make a stand, this was the place. Noya didn't question the choice. She moved with quiet efficiency, helping unhitch the mule, stacking loose stones near the canyon wall. Jonas checked the rifle, the spare cartridges, the line of sight through the narrow gap between rocks. There would be no running now, Not this time. The night crept in heavy and slow. The stars blinked awake one by one, and the moon, thin as a knife's edge, cast just enough light to see by, but not enough to be seen. Jonas crouched near the bend, eye pressed to the scope of the old long-barrel rifle he'd kept oiled for years but rarely used. Noya lay flat against the rock wall opposite, a smaller rifle cradled close, breath slow, controlled. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The crunch came just after midnight, hooves on loose gravel, soft, hesitant, but coming. Jonas counted 3, no 4. The figures moved cautiously into the canyon, silhouetted by the faint light behind them. The leader rode at a slow pace, gun drawn but lowered, scanning the cliffs. They weren't charging. They were hunting. Jonas waited until they were fully within the choke point. Then, without warning, crack. A shot split the air, slamming into the dirt 3 feet in front of the lead horse.
The animal reared, screaming. The rider yanked the reins, cursing, spinning to retreat, but found the exit behind him blocked by the others. Another shot rang out, this one from Noya, clipping the saddle horn of the second rider. Shouting now. Confusion. A pistol raised. Jonas didn't hesitate. Third shot clean, hard, center chest. One rider tumbled backward, hitting the earth with a sickening thud. The canyon echoed with it. The rest, they ran. Hard. Dust flying behind them as they tore from the narrow pass like men chased by ghosts. And maybe they were. Jonas lowered his rifle, exhaled. The canyon fell silent again. Only the wind remained low and dry, curling through the rocks like breath after a scream. Noya stood slowly, brushing dust from her knees. She walked to where Jonas still crouched, her face unreadable in the dark. He looked at her. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. No. They stared down the path the riders had come, but no sound followed. It was done, at least for now. Noya leaned back against the canyon wall, let her rifle rest across her lap, and for the first time she smiled. Not polite, not forced, a real smile, soft, quiet, the kind that slips out when your ribs stop guarding your lungs. She looked at him, eyes glinting in the starlight. "For the first time," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "I think I can breathe." Jonas didn't reply, but he smiled too, because he knew. So could he. Peace doesn't come with silence alone. It comes when you know no one's coming to take it from you. They had ridden far since the canyon, farther than either of them thought they would. Past the bone-dry hills, past the places where trees grew low and wide like they were afraid to stand too tall, past the thin trails carved by strangers long gone. Until, one morning, the world changed. It wasn't dramatic, just softer. The air smelled of water and wild mint. The ground, for once, wasn't cracked but rich, dark, and forgiving underfoot. A stream wound through the valley, slow and cold and clean. Birds gathered near its edge, not startled by the sight of humans. Deer tracks dotted the bank. Jonas reined in the mule and looked out at the basin below. A broad green curve, cradled between the arms of 2 old hills. Protected. Hidden. "This is it," he said. Noya didn't answer at first. She stepped down, walked to the edge of the grass, knelt, and pressed her fingers into the earth. It crumbled softly in her palm, warm and alive. She smiled, small, but certain. They didn't run anymore. They built. The cabin came first. Jonas chopped, measured, nailed. He carved a life one beam at a time, shoulders sore, hands blistered, but heart steady. Noya hauled stone from the stream bed for the fireplace, stacked kindling, patched gaps with clay and straw. The home rose in 3 weeks, small, just enough for two, a table, a bed, a window facing east, and another facing nothing but sky. Next came the garden. Noya planted sage, wormwood, and sweetgrass, herbs for food, for healing, for remembering. She knelt with care, fingers moving through the dirt like they belonged there. Jonas built her a fence not to keep things out, but to mark what was theirs. They hunted little. The land fed them slowly but surely. Fish, root vegetables, what berries the birds hadn't stolen. They no longer whispered at night. They spoke, softly, honestly, sometimes not in full sentences, but it was enough. One evening, as the sun bled into gold across the horizon, Noya stood beside the doorway. Her dress was patched but clean, her hair braided back. She held something in her palm, a small loop of dark braided leather, worn but unbroken. She held it out. Jonas didn't ask where it came from. He didn't need to. "It was mine," she said. "Before." She paused. "I want it to be yours. Now." Jonas took it gently, like a thing alive. "I didn't save you," he said, looking at her straight. "You walked out on your own 2 feet. "I know," she replied. He slid the ring onto his finger. It fit snug, but not tight. "They didn't say I do. They didn't need to. There were no guests, no preacher, just the hush of a quiet land and the sound of something old finally becoming something new." Later that night, as they sat outside watching the stars rise, Noya asked him, "Did you ever think you'd build again?" Jonas shook his head. "I thought I was done with building, with roots." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You weren't done," she said, "just waiting." A few days later, Noya added a new row to the garden lavender and chamomile. Flowers not for survival, but for beauty. Jonas laughed when he saw it. "What do we need flowers for?" he teased. She looked up from the soil, smirked slightly. "Because we can." He didn't argue. Days passed. Then, weeks. The seasons turned. One morning, Jonas woke early and found her outside in the garden, bare feet damp with dew. She looked back at him, hair loose around her shoulders, and in that light, with nothing between them but the air and the growing things, he saw not the girl behind the locked door, not the woman in hiding, but the one who had stayed, the one who had chosen, and for the first time in his life, he was not waiting for the next loss. He was simply here, whole, still, and finally home. She wasn't just safe. She was home. Some stories stay with us not because they are loud, but because they whisper truths we've long forgotten. Jonas and Noya's journey reminds us that healing doesn't always come in grand moments. Sometimes it begins with a stranger offering kindness when the world has been nothing but cruel. It grows in silence, in shared meals, in the steady rebuilding of trust, brick by quiet brick. We all carry pasts that leave scars, regrets, and roads we no longer walk. But this story shows that it's never too late to choose again, to find someone who sees us not for what we've lost, but for who we still are, and to build something lasting not from perfection, but from the courage to stay when it's easier to leave. In a world rushing forward, may we remember the value of quiet strength, of slow forgiveness, and of choosing love not out of obligation, but because it's what feels true. May we all, in our own way, find that patch of land where peace can finally grow. Thank you for walking this quiet road with us. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Echoes. Your support helps us bring more forgotten voices back to life. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let us know
What part of the story stayed with you? Until next time, may peace find you, wherever you are.